So in this section, we're talking about what autism means and introducing people to the diagnosis of autism. So Kerry, in your role as Family Development Manager at the North East Autism Society, you work a lot with families who have children who've recently been diagnosed with autism.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say autism means to you?
Yeah, so I think autism fundamentally is a difference in neurology. So we talk a lot about difference rather than deficit, and I think that's really important. And then we would look at those key differences really. So, you know, differences in sensory processing, differences in communication, differences in emotional processing and how people make sense of the world around them. So yeah, for us and you know what we know many autistic people prefer is looking at that difference rather than a deficit model.
Yeah. Marie, what about from your point of view in speech and language therapy? How would you describe autism and how it affects people?
Well, I think obviously picking up on Kerry's point that it is a difference, and for me as a speech and language therapist, my focus is around a child's communication and their language development. And I would always say to families that every child is different, so it is really hard to predict what's going to happen to them in the future, and we really need to sort of get to know them as an individual and learn about what's different for them in terms of how they communicate. It's not something that we can take away from the child, and the autism is part of them, a bit like having green eyes or blue eyes. It's there, it's part of them, and we need to focus on how are they communicating now. Lots of children we see might be using words and sentences, but equally we see lots of children who haven't developed any words yet, and that's obviously for parents is a really big concern and a big focus. So for me it is about looking at the child, how can we help them to communicate and get their message across, and help them when they're in nursery to sort of function and to be able to join in socially, but also with the learning aspects of that. So I think for me that is trying to sort of communicate to parents that actually we need to see your child as an individual. We know a lot about autism generally and how it affects people, but we need every child is different, and understanding their profile is the most important thing.
I think that's important, Marie, what you just said, that difference in communication, in that, you know, there's many ways we can communicate. It's not just about speech, so it's about finding out what works for that child, whether that's pictures or writing things down or drawing.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, isn't it, that people realise that, you know, communication isn't just speech. It's not just that reliance on speech.
Yeah, I think sometimes for me as a speech and language therapist, obviously that's in my title, that's our name of our profession, but I think for speech and language therapists who work with children with autism and their families, actually I would much prefer to be called a communication therapist, because it definitely is more than words, and
Absolutely.
It's much broader. Yeah.
So Alice, from your point of view as an occupational therapist, how would you see the differences in children with autism, and how would you describe them and describe your role?
So, echoing everything that everyone has said so far, you know, it's important to acknowledge that all children are different, and for children with autism, they are likely to experience the world very differently to everyone else. And during development, when we start to learn about the world, we do that predominantly through sensory experiences and interactions with others, and particularly our parents and carers around us. And as an occupational therapist, it's our role to make sure that children can access different daily activities, and if there's any problems with those or difficulties, trying to unpick why that might be. And for a lot of children with autism, it quite often boils down to having sensory processing differences and the way they experience the world around them and how they interact with it. And also what's really important in occupational therapy is that we don't just focus on the child. We think about the environment, so what's going on in the environment, how can we change the setting around a child to make it more enabling for them. And also the occupation itself. So is it eating, for example? Are they having difficulty trying new foods? And what is it about the foods that we're offering the child and how we're presenting it to them? Is there a way that we can change that is better suited to the needs of that child? And of course, finally, also empowering parents and carers and understanding that the child has got a high dependency on the adult that's looking after them, and making sure that we can support you to be able to understand your child, understand if there are sensory differences, how they are working, so that you are empowered to support the child to the best that you can. And of course, working alongside other professionals that are working with your child to make sure that we can optimise their development and empower them to engage in daily activities of living.
Okay.
Is that okay?
So from my point of view as a doctor, I am looking for differences, as everybody said, in a way a particular child learns, and specifically looking for differences in how they socially interact with other people, how they communicate with other people, and also around their interests in play, and whether it's very focused and repetitive or unusual, and if that is different from a typically developing child their age. And that's what autism means to me, those differences in social interaction and communication, and differences in interests in life. I'm also thinking about why as well. So part of my role as a doctor is to think about, is there something underlying all of this? And we know for a lot of children that we see who have a diagnosis of autism, that there is a genetic condition underlying that. And in the clinics we run, we offer blood tests to look for genetics and for other quite rare conditions that can sometimes be associated with autism. So it's important to do that at the beginning to find them if they're there. We know over time, as genetic testing got better, we're picking up more and more unusual genes that can be associated with autism. So that's something I'm always conscious with. The other thing I often say to families is there are those differences from typical development that most children with autism have in common, but as an individual child, although I've seen hundreds of children now with autism, I don't think I've ever seen 2 children with autism who are exactly the same. So the pattern for every child with autism is different. So although there might be difficulties with communication or social interaction, for an individual child they might have a particular strength in one area and be having real difficulties, say, with repetitiveness and very fixed interests in another area. So sometimes families say, well, where are they on this spectrum, and almost expect us to give a score, if you like. And what I describe is, it's not the difference between, volume going from 0 to 10, between a little bit and a lot. It's much more complicated than that. It's almost like, rather than just having a volume switch, it's rather like those big desks that you see in a mixing studio. If you see bands filming where there's loads of different knobs that you can, and sliders you can go up and down, you might have one that's particularly high and one low, but it isn't just as simple as soft and loud. I think that said, the international criteria that we look at now do divide children in terms of the level of the support, for children and adults, in terms of the level of support they're needing, from people who don't require a huge amount of support to people who have big differences in their social and communication needs and need quite high levels of support. So that's sometimes a way to look at it. But I think early on, after a child's diagnosed, I think that is often quite difficult. We can broadly say where they are at that point, that these problems aren't small or mild maybe, but what I find impossible, and I think any professional would if they're honest, is where that means they're going to be in a year or 5 years' time. And certainly in my professional experience over many years now, I've seen children with quite a high level of need early on. I was really quite concerned about, and reviewed them 2 or 3 years down the line, and I almost can't believe how much progress is made. And equally, I've seen children where I felt there was some really nice skills emerging, and I feel that there was a lot to build on, and then they just seem to plateau and not make much progress. So I think one of the hardest things for families, and for me much less so as a professional, is I can't predict the future, and I'm always honest saying that to families, but I think living with that uncertainty about knowing what the next year and 5 years and 10 years holds, I think is really difficult.
And I think I don't think it's helpful as well, Helen, and a lot of families will hear terms like high functioning and low functioning, which isn't something that is diagnosed, it's just terms that people have used over time. And I think that they're very problematic in that high functioning, we often assume competence in every area, and then low functioning, we often assume incompetence. And I think, you know, the families that I work with, I talk to them about those type of labels, that they're not helpful at all, and that it's not, you know, we'd be looking at like what you're saying, we look at that child as an individual with all differences, with all different needs, and kind of look at the holistic development rather than sticking these kind of unhelpful labels on children.
Yeah, and I would say as well that for a lot of children, actually their own personality actually still has a big impact, and we can see that some children are very easygoing, very laid back. You know, they might have actually very limited communication or some sensory needs, but actually their personality is also quite a relaxed, laid back child, and they don't seem to present with as many difficulties or concerns as another child who might have actually very good language skills or, you know, very good high learning ability, but actually, you know, they're very kind of frustrated a lot of the time and, you know, very anxious, and there's all different factors, so it is a really complex area, and I think people who work in autism recognise that you never get to the end of learning about autism. That there's always something new to learn, and you know, I think all of us would probably be seen as very experienced in the field, but we would all still have things to learn, and you know, we're keen to find new ways of supporting families and working with them.
So I think we've all agreed that those differences are there and we can't take them away. That doesn't mean there's that there isn't a lot we can't all do to help, otherwise we wouldn't be here today and we'd all be out of a job, and we're going to talk about that more in subsequent videos. I think one of the things we would all caution against would be people going out and seeking cures, in inverted commas, on the internet. People offering tablets or certain interventions that they're charging a lot of money for. I think usually are to be steered clear from. I think if we understand why families are looking for things, because you know, all the families we see are really keen to help their children, which is lovely, but just run it by some qualified professional if you're seeking extra help from elsewhere, because there are some things out there which can be unhelpful that we have all come across. We're definitely willing to support people getting help from other areas. We work closely with the North East Autism Society. We're keen to engage help from anybody, but it's got to be the right sort of help with the right intentions. So in subsequent videos, we're going to talk more about how we can help, and we're going to talk more about what the future holds.